Thank you very much. Thank you to those who are on Zoom and, of course, to everyone who is here live. It's a real pleasure, and obviously you can tell I'm quite nervous because getting back to in-person is exciting, but also a bit nerve-wracking. I was in Italy recently, and it was a room filled with people there, so I'm easing back into face-to-face. So I really appreciate you being here and being on Zoom for those of you who are away. So let me begin. When asked about tonight's talk, many of my friends who know me well were surprised that I would agree to give a lecture, let alone give my last lecture. Friends, colleagues, students who know me well enough, they know I don't do lectures. I never have liked the term, nor the assumption that professors simply lecture at students. As a high school teacher, I learned early on that lecturing isn't the best way or the most effective way to communicate. Not if you want people to take away something that you're saying. Not surprisingly, I searched up the term lecture, and the Cambridge Dictionary says it is a formal talk on a serious subject given to a group, especially students. It also said it's an angry or serious talk given to someone to criticize a behavior. That even made me more nervous when I thought about what I had agreed to do. I'm not sure I want to or can do a lecture tonight. What I want to do is share my ideas, to raise questions, and maybe provoke you to rethink masculinity and gender arrangements. Think about it. Ever get a lecture from your parents and walk away feeling happy? Thanks for that lecture. I really needed that. Thanks, Mom. No, usually when we get a lecture from those who love us, the intention is in the right place, from the heart, but the medium, the lecture, isn't always hitting the right notes. My son knows when I'm about to lecture. It's not usually because he's done any one thing requiring a lecture. When I talk with him about some social issues, for example, he usually responds with, "Thanks, Dad," as though it was an update. Or it doesn't come across as a lecture to him. It's just, "Thanks for reminding me." I feel in some cases for my kids, my son and my daughter, at least, in their cases, these conversations are almost like a public service announcement from your dad. So think of your profs. It's not often you run home to your roommates or parents and rave about the lecture you got on astrophysics last night. Or maybe you do. But some of us, when we do rave about those lectures, we get it because we enjoy and we're motivated, interested in the topic at hand. The other side of the lecture, when it is compelling, is that it makes sense, or it has great visuals, or there's at least some way that you connect to that lecture. So what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that I may not be the best person to lecture. Not if it means moaning on about something that you'd rather not hear in the first place. I did read the book, The Last Lecture, by Randy Pausch. I also looked online and watched part of his lecture. He delivered it, his last lecture, prompted by his diagnosis with cancer. This is the opportunity for me to share with you lessons learned, as he said in his lecture. It's my chance to leave with you some final thoughts, maybe some nuggets that you might take away. Something to remember when Kehler is gone. My mother never lectured at me. She raised 4 boys by herself and left me with many lessons. And her platform wasn't a stage, it was her life experiences. A few of those nuggets or those lessons that she taught me repeatedly. 1, don't forget where you came from. 2, Things happen for a reason. 3, you're not as important as you think you are. And 4, pursue your passion. My talk today is about my passion. I want to take tonight as an opportunity to share insights and maybe not lessons per se, like those of my mother. It's my final lecture after all, and happily, I'm not going anywhere, or maybe I am, and the message is in the mail. Maybe the dean just hasn't told me yet. Although she did say she was going to be watching, so we'll see. I suspect I'm still going to be here. I'm on sabbatical at the moment, so when asked to deliver the last lecture, I worried that the dean hadn't told me that this is indeed my final sabbatical, and I wouldn't be returning. Well, I've checked my office, and no one has changed the locks on it yet. It was quite dusty, given I haven't been there for a couple of years, thanks to COVID. And my mailbox is still cluttered, so I think I'm pretty good. I'm here to stay. It's pretty daunting, though, when I was nominated to be a speaker, and to be clear, I don't take anything for granted. When I got that email inviting me to be a speaker tonight, I gushed with excitement at the opportunity to be invited to speak so publicly. Tonight's talk is The Courage to Change, Masculinity, Misogyny, and Bro Culture. Courage seems like such a simple concept. Many of us may remember The Wizard of Oz and the quality of the lion, who wanted to find courage to do something that is right, regardless of the disapproval of others. When I was growing up, my lion was my mother, lioness. She taught me life lessons, and courage is just one of those lessons. Long story short, I lost my dad when I was 6 years old. My 3 brothers, older brothers, were all under 12, and my mom had no job, no home, and no family. She emigrated from the United Kingdom after the war. Her parents remained in the UK while my mom came to Canada. In the years that followed my dad passing away, in the determination she showed to apply herself, to grow her skills, to raise 4 boys, I saw courage in the face of adversity. She was a widower, on her own with 4 demanding boys, very little money, and she had to move out of our house that we rented within a month of my dad passing. She didn't go back to England after my dad died. No, my mom was determined and indeed courageous in the face of others who said she needed a man to help her through, to support her. My mom raised us boys by herself with the support of friends and family. That's the kind of courage I'm pointing to tonight when I speak of the courage to change. This takes inner strength and determination. And for many of us, we show courage in facing the day-to-day battles, however small or daunting they may be. We count on that inner strength to move on to be the change that we can be. Tonight, I'll talk with you about the courage to change, what can be changed. I'm not asking you to change the impossible. I'm asking you to look in the corners of the world and see where you can and when you can change what might be there to be changed. I want you to think about the ways in which we might change and shift the narrative of masculinity. Tonight, I'm asking you to consider how masculinity might change, how we might change what we thought we knew about masculinity as singular, as restrictive, as limiting, as biological, And instead, I'm asking you to consider masculinity as fluid, as plural, as diverse. I'm asking us to open up a dialogue that instead of relying on biological determinism, as in other words, boys will be boys, why not acknowledge the complexity of gender arrangements and the intersection of race, class, ethnicity, and sexualities? And why not consider how gender, and specifically masculinities, are performed, expressed, and maintained? So, the question, why masculinity? What can a white boy raised by his mother have to say about being a man when I didn't even have a dad, a man to show me how to become a man? That will either throw up red flags to many of you, and you'll log out quickly and sign off of this Zoom, or if I'm optimistic, it'll make you lean in. Listen closely. This man, white, privileged, cisgender male, raised by his mother, is here to talk about the courage to change masculinity. Yes, that's right. And I've seen it enough times at conferences and in various other settings when the penny drops. And some either lean in with anticipation, or they sit back, almost dismissive of the idea that I take the position of interrogating, questioning privileged masculinity. More often than not, the ones leaning back, the ones who are dismissive, the men, usually, who lean back are the ones who formulate questions that attempt to discount my research, my sexuality, my very ability to be an ally, an advocate for change. I've seen it enough over my 20 years as a researcher in masculinity studies. I'll be honest, given what I've experienced and seen in my life about becoming a man, and then dedicating my career to challenging masculinity, I may not be here to suggest we need to change masculinity, but I am here to talk about embracing and supporting diverse masculinities. I'm here to provoke us all to consider the social, the cultural, and contextual norms that inform and guide our expectations of masculinity. So what does that mean exactly? I'll begin briefly with a few remarks about masculinity. I remember an education student at Western, where I used to teach, Western University in Ontario, asking me if he could read some of my research. I was flattered, surprised, flattered, excited. I gave him an article called Masculinities and Resistance, High School Boys Undoing Boys. I saw him a few days later and he told me he read it in the cafeteria. He also told me he was kind of embarrassed to read it. We talked about why he was embarrassed. He explained to me that as a man, he shouldn't have to read about it, about being a man. He should just know it. What will people think? He explained. I am a man. I know how to do it. His comments reminded me of the masculinities course I taught at Western in what was called Women's Studies at the time. There were 10% of my students in those classes were male identifying. Boys know all too well how to do boy, so why would they bother taking a course on it? As he read my article, he also commented that reading about the boys in high school who rejected sexism and misogyny really resonated with him. It all made sense. He knew those boys. They just weren't one of the boys, but they were there in the school. They just weren't as prominent or as valorized as the boys. Our conversation highlights the various ways in which boys navigate different spaces in schools. It also highlights some of the struggles, the tensions that boys experience and what they reveal or want others to know about how they present themselves as masculine, as men. It points to some of the uncertainties, the vulnerabilities, the fears of some boys about how they are read and misread, understood, accepted, and oftentimes rejected as boys. Some of you may know, in 2018, the American Psychological Association developed new guidelines for the psychological practice with boys and men. In academia, this is like someone changed the landscape. The American Psychological Association, that's big. Well, at least in our world it is. That should tell you something about the world I live in. This move by the Psychological Association actually suggested that gender and our social identities intersect in varying and different ways to inform how men experience and perform masculinities. In other words, men are not simply naturally aggressive, naturally violent because of our biology. That is huge. In my research, I challenged the biological assumptions that have for too long polarized males and females. This binaristic kind of thinking typically relies on biology to explain away behaviors and attitudes as being innately masculine or feminine. The APA has embraced a complex, and I would suggest a messier, understanding of masculinities as socially constructed, as a cultural set of ideas and attitudes of what it means to be a man. Talk about a geek moment for many of my colleagues and I. We even came up with a special issue, not a sitcom, but the Journal of Men and Masculinities actually showcased the significance of this move by the American Psychological Association. We developed a special issue to address this. I'll tell you, if you haven't already guessed, I was one of those boys on the margins. Not one of the cool boys. I was a boy who had no father, who wasn't groomed, trained, taught how to be the right kind of boy. I wasn't sitting around watching hockey with my mom. She didn't enroll us in hockey, nor football, not even soccer, nor any sports, really. We were enrolled in guitar class, accordion playing, leather crafts. Oh, but she did, as you saw in the previous slide, enroll me in Scouts. We couldn't afford a lot, and I'm not sure she wanted us to be schooled in sports, let alone be schooled in a fairly traditional view of masculinity, centering on toughness and athleticism. She'd be sadly disappointed if indeed she wanted me to just be one of the boys. I'm pretty confident my mother never wanted me to just be among the boys so that I could fit in. No, I'm pretty sure that as she watched us four boys grow up, she knew how diverse we were, how individual we were. In my case, I was among the boys, but not of the boys. Let me explain. You may know those boys, the sporty boys, the dominant boys, the cool boys. The cool boys, if in fact you're not one yourself. The boys who knew the right things to say. The boys who told a joke and always got the laughter. The boys who were surrounded by the other cool, popular boys. The boys who were on the sports teams. The cool boys. It's important to remind ourselves that those cool boys knew the rules. They abided by the norms of being among the boys. It's not that they didn't want to resist some of the rules, and it's not that they always agreed with the rest of the rules, and they didn't always agree with the boys. When they started, for example, teasing the boy in the corner, or the boy who walked down the gauntlet into the cafeteria. Those popular boys went along with the rules because they saw the consequences, like we all do. They knew what it meant to reject the rules for being one of the boys. Many of you probably heard about St. Michael's College School in Toronto. In fact, it was 3 years ago in November of 2018 where a group of boys, sporty boys, circled around another boy in the locker room and hazed him. Sorry, I didn't mean hazed, I meant sexually assaulted him. A video circulated of the assault, filmed by another boy, while others held the boy down. The teen who was charged, found guilty, explained that he feared he'd be targeted if he didn't participate. So he followed along and did what the other boys expected him to do. He was given probation, no jail time, for his assault. And the judge, she thought that would hold him accountable. This isn't the first time we've heard boys follow other boys because they fear being targeted. We ourselves might know similar situations, like the case in a high school in southwestern Ontario, where the school hockey team was suspended for circulating intimate images without consent. The team was suspended because they breached the school code of conduct. This is not just a them problem. This is our problem. Boys being boys, boys following the rules of other boys, and boys struggling, no, not struggling, failing. Failing to speak up from among the boys. Boys failing to know how to stop the violence, to stop the sexism and misogyny in the boys' club. These are high school boys, teenagers. They're learning the rules, the code of masculinity. And how are boys held to be accountable, as the judge said in Toronto? How are we teaching boys to be accountable for violence, for assaults, for maintaining that whisper culture we all know to maintain our privilege and membership among the boys? How do we hold them to account? The examples of boys violently asserting themselves on other boys at the hands of others, however they identify, is well known. It is the subject of much research. My own earlier research, for example, questioned how and when boys reject sexism and gender stereotypes in high school. Yet these teens, these boys, are learning about a culture of masculinity from within and among the boys. They are learning about bro culture. A researcher in the United Kingdom, Dr. Carolyn Jackson, writes about lad culture, as it's called in the UK. She highlights the extent of the problem beyond the UK and Australia context, noting that the prevalence of sexual harassment is highest among women students, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse and disabled students. She also found in her research that universities underestimate the pervasiveness of lad culture. In fact, she refers to it as part of the wallpaper of sexism because it is so normal and unremarkable. She draws attention to the fact that lad culture is not merely a personal problem of a few bad apples, it's an institutional culture problem. As some of you may know, I've been pushing or tweeting, because I tweet a lot, for universities to acknowledge bro culture, lad culture, that has seemingly, according to many administrators, is just beyond their reach. They often default to the "what can we do" position. But I want to suggest tonight that university administration can change university culture. We can change the culture to become more inclusive, to be safer for all of us. It won't happen by itself, and it won't happen overnight. But change comes with courage, and change comes with a concerted effort to disrupt power, disrupt privilege, and change comes to disrupt normative masculinity, the limited and damaging ways that boys and men impose, project privileged masculinity that has been accepted as just boys being boys. In a piece I wrote for the University of Calgary Alumni magazine, I question whether, in fact, men are talking in light of the significant movement we saw with #MeToo. I worry that some men aren't listening. There's a lot of defensiveness and suggestion that it's not me, it's them. And there's less acknowledgement, uptake among men willing to accept the fact that we are among the men. We are participating in a system of domination, sexism, and misogyny. It's easier to cry foul, like some did with the recent, if you recall, the Gillette commercial of a couple of years ago. We believe the best men can be. With that commercial, many men claim that, but that's not me. If you look at my research, you'll know I don't suggest that all men are bad. It's not that easy. We do, however, participate in a context in which we all know and understand what it means to be manly, to be masculine, to show membership among men. We know how to do it. And for many of us, we abide by those rules. Consider, for example, the cases of sexual harassment and violence across a host of Canadian universities witnessed during homecoming this past fall. FOCO, HOCO, Queen's, Western, Acadia, the list goes on. If you saw the images, the videos, it's thousands of students looking to fit in, to be a part of the crowd. It's not shocking, really. The conditions to party, the context of homecoming, gathering with friends, it all seemed to stack up and ended in cases after cases of complaints, property damage, drunkenness, assaults, and public displays of outright misogyny. Acadia said, and I quote, "It was deeply disappointed." And students would be fined for property damage. Dalhousie, are you ready? Gravely disappointed for the deplorable, reckless behavior, end quote. Queen's University had similar problems of drunkenness and property damage at its homecoming. And the behavior of some boys was further evident when Queen's students hung misogynist banners in front of their house, sexualizing and degrading women. You can only imagine what the president at Queen's University said when he publicly expressed, are you ready? Extreme disappointment about the reckless behavior. This is not reckless behavior. It wasn't careless or sloppy. It was intentional and purposeful. That's not what I'd suggest is reckless. Is it dangerous? You bet. Did the tenants, the boys at the houses, think no one would react? No one would be offended? No one would feel threatened, unsafe by those signs? Did they actually think this through? The actions, the attitudes of the boys who decided to make the signs are inexcusable. These signs are an expression of power and willful disregard for others who would feel threatened and degraded. What was going through their minds when they decided to hang up those signs? It's a bit of harmless fun? Is that what they were thinking? This is Queen's University, that has the second highest rate of reported sexual assaults in Ontario and the fourth highest incidence of sexual assault. The principal at Queen's later acknowledged, and I quote, he said, "The signs poison the quality of the university environment, causing the threat of sexual violence to hang over heads of women and those vulnerable to harassment and assault," end quote. Western University, Homecoming, also saw reports of sexual violence. The reaction from the president at Western was predictable. He was, quote, troubled and disturbed by the reports of sexual violence and drugging of women, roofied. In his tweets, his media responses, he promised, quote, swift action, end quote. Yet it took him a week to acknowledge it is a problem of the university culture that needs to be addressed. A week. And I assure you, there was no shortage of tweets coming from me or the public calling for immediate action. 2 years earlier, Western was the same place that students hung misogynist banners, yet no students were held to account. There is an attempt by many administrators to either suggest they can't police off-campus behavior, or it's out of their hands and simply something they are aware of but won't address. Now, you may agree or disagree whether the university has a responsibility. I'm suggesting we as a university need to think hard about how we conduct ourselves, how we express ourselves, and the impact that has on our communities. Where does this leave us? What does the current state of affairs tell us about masculinity, about bro culture, about misogyny and university accountability? Not easy questions, and certainly no easy answers. What I can tell you tonight is that there are possibilities. Call me crazy, but I'm an optimist. I do believe that change can come about from among men. I do believe we can change what we understand and know. What we hear and respond to as men is as telling as what men refuse to accept, refuse to listen to, refuse to rise up to and respond to. Let me turn in this final part tonight to share with you what I see as the possibilities, the potential for movement, the potential for men to be unlike the rest of the boys. I'll preface this last part by acknowledging that I know the work to be done to push back, to rethink, to reimagine masculinity is not easy. You already know I have a son and a daughter. Both are at university. For my 18-year-old son, he has not always been just one of the boys. He's had to learn how to navigate among the boys, how to maintain his views of masculinity and not compromise or be complicit simply to be accepted by the rest of the boys. I also know that my 20-year-old daughter has had to confront sporty masculinity. She is a competitive swimmer on a university team, and she sees sporty boys. She knows the culture of which I speak. It takes courage It takes courage to speak back, to find the voice, to take the space, to be heard, and to know you will be believed. At the beginning of tonight, I briefly mentioned the concept of courage and its role in my mother's life. Courage is similarly significant in dislodging men from complacency, in mobilizing men. Ironically, it's also a quality that many men pride themselves on being full of. Yet, many struggle to muster the courage to mobilize when it comes to addressing sexism, misogyny, homophobia, and gender inequality. Bell Hooks reminds us that, and I quote, "Due to males' positions of power and privilege, they are primary agents maintaining and supporting sexism and sexist oppression. Thus, they are fundamental in dismantling and redefining gender relations alongside women." End quote. It's not surprising then that I want to end tonight with a series of examples to illustrate when and how men can change. I believe men can be agents for change, of change. There are many campaigns and efforts on various scales to challenge gender stereotypes, to disrupt normative masculinity, and to speak out against violence against women and engage men and boys as advocates and allies. The Moose Hide campaign is an indigenous-led grassroots movement of men and boys designed to hold men and boys accountable to end violence against women and children. Pro Mundo USA promotes gender equality and engages boys and men in partnership with women and girls. Worldwide Roar is a nonprofit organization working with sport allies to address homophobia in team sport. These are a few of the organized efforts to disrupt normative masculinity. 3 campaigns I'd like to briefly highlight tonight at length operate at different levels and in different contexts. One, launched by a group of teenage boys in Montreal. The second is a UK campaign from Police Scotland. And the third one is a Canadian campaign launched 30 years ago. I share these 3 examples because they illustrate the power of organized campaigns on different levels, from the individual school teams to the institutional to the nonprofit. Let me start with Boys in Skirts in Montreal. In October of 2020, a group of teenage boys saw the school dress code dictating the length of skirts above the knee for girls as discriminatory and sexualizing. They opted to protest the dress code by wearing skirts to school. The protest spread to several other schools in Montreal. The girls were told that the school was a distraction to boys. The obvious discrimination in the school dress code provoked these young men to speak up and to initiate a conversation and to extend it to social media. Hashtag Jupe pour tout. In this case, the boys saw the injustices, the discrimination, the institutional discrimination rooted in outdated ideas, surveillance of women's bodies, dress codes, and unfairly targeting and controlling women remains as evidence of systemic discrimination in schools. Groups of boys at various schools organized in solidarity with young women to speak out against this injustice. This is action. This is advocacy. The other campaign I'll speak to is one newly developed by Police Scotland, social media, in social media, hashtag don't be that guy. If we want to play that. In their latest campaign to address sexual violence, they prompt men to look in the mirror because the problem is staring us in the face. It's an invitation by men to look in the mirror, to see, to hear, to acknowledge the fact that rape culture, sexual violence, begins with our actions, attitudes, and behaviors, all of which can be changed. These are not natural. They are learned, they are repeated, and they are heralded as tough guys being among the boys. This is a performance of masculinity that we see produced and reproduced time and again, and yet we brush it off as boys being boys. This campaign is a call out to men, to boys, to look where it counts. Look in the mirror and then act to change what we see. It's not a matter of changing the mirror, and it's not a matter of looking away. It's a matter of looking more deeply and then changing what you see and hear, because that's where action starts. And that's where advocacy begins. The last campaign I'll mention is the White Ribbon Campaign. WhiteRibbon.ca 2021 marks 30 years of advocacy to end gender-based violence. Men can be allies to advocate for change, ending gender-based violence, and building a new vision of masculinity. In their recent release of Boys Don't Cry, which you can find online, we hear the inner voice of a boy and the competing voices he hears about being a boy. It's a powerful video because it shows the contradictions, the struggles for boys to live up to expectations. It demonstrates for us the sort of pressures, the constant messaging of being brave, be strong, be fast, be a big boy. While the boy himself acknowledges boys can be sad, boys can be self-conscious, intelligent. But the boy in the video learns quickly, boys can't be afraid. Boys can't be gentle or meek or soft. The campaign shows the growth, the development of boys into men who eventually accept and indeed embrace the norms, rules of masculinity, teaching us all that boys don't cry. I look at UCalgary and I ask myself, why doesn't UCalgary have a White Ribbon campaign? At UCalgary, we have Students Against Domestic Abuse Association. We also have an advocate for sexual and gender-based violence support leader. In addition, myself in collaboration with others from this office, have produced a report developed to, and I quote, start addressing and changing the climate of sexual violence, harassment, and hazing within varsity athletics, end quote. This report, that is not yet public, showcases the facts. In other words, this report showcases the reality that, based on feedback provided through surveys and interviews with athletes, alumni, and coaches, sexual violence and hazing occurs on our campus. We, like many universities across Canada and internationally, indeed fall into the "it happens, but it just doesn't happen here" category. I'll close. We don't want to believe that it is so. There's a culture of silence on university campuses, among the bros, and specifically among university athletes, in which hazing and team building are dismissed as simply that, team building, as opportunities to become closer, to develop membership. What is missing from this understanding is the sort of silence, the sort of whisper culture that manifests itself echoing in the halls of locker rooms. And while athletes, team members may whisper in dissent when they witness or experience hazing or the degradation of others or inappropriate behavior, they nonetheless fear speaking out because they too know there's a cost for stepping out of the shadows of others. They know that membership has its privilege. Men and boys, we are of our own making. I am the man you see because of the men I've known and the men I've lost. I am an advocate for gender equality, not crippled by fear, but prompted by courage. I am confident in men as allies, as advocates for change, because I know acceptance is not defined in boardrooms, locker rooms, or in the local pubs. I have seen the damage and lived with the pain of mental health, suicide, and masculinity. I've spoken most recently in the complexity of masculinities in a recent TEDx YYC talk, in which I describe those rules for being a man and the impact it has on those we love and those we're surrounded by. In a month marked by Movember, a campaign acknowledging men's mental health and suicide, November 26th is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Our lives are punctuated by calls for action. Starting November 26th, Canadians observe the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. In addition, December 6th commemorates the Montreal massacre at École Polytechnique, when a man killed 14 women in an anti-feminist mass shooting. It's a national day of remembrance and action on violence against women. It is upon us all, and yes, it is on men and boys to rise, to act, to own the possibilities, allowing us to change the narrative of masculinity and not deflect or deny our role as allies or advocates for change. For many, we may be paralyzed by fear of being rejected, of being marginalized by the rest of the boys. I understand that fear. What I don't understand is how debilitating that fear is for many men and boys who struggle to act, to speak up and speak out when they see and hear the harm and damaging impact narrow, restrictive versions of masculinity have on others. We need to find the courage, the strength, the motivation to be unlike the rest of the boys and instead to be the change and to be an ally for change. We need to be change agents. Thank you.